Russia has never lost territory to an external invader since the Second World War. This is something that is just totally runs against what Putin makes out that he is, that he's the defender of the fatherland.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine and the incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. And I'm delighted to be joined by George Grylls, the Times' defence correspondent. George, welcome to Frontline.
Thanks very much, James.
First of all, let's begin with the Kursk incursion. We're a week into it now. A lot of people have described it as a big gamble by President Zelensky, but so far, is it a gamble that's paying off?
It's certainly irritated the Russians, and crucially, it's changed the mood. I think we got to reflect on the months leading up to this point. You know, I'm sure you've discussed plenty about the kind of grinding offensive in the east, which appeared to be giving the Russians the upper hand. You know, this was a type of warfare that favoured them. It favoured numerical strength. It favoured resources. And despite the kind of ridiculous casualties that they were incurring, they have been making ground. And you know, the town of Pokrovsk, this garrison town, which is kind of lining up to be a key battle, Ukraine seemed to be on the defensive, and the mood was very pessimistic, and understandably so. What this has done is completely change the narrative. And that's important for the Ukrainians, both domestically and internationally. From a domestic point of view, I mean, 2.5 years of grueling war where you're woken in the middle of the night, night after night, by drone and missile strikes, it wears a population down. You know, you need to keep the people invested in this conflict. And, for example, the way in which the Ukrainians have there's been a kind of gleeful impishness about this incursion. You look at the way in which their armoured vehicles and tanks have got these kind of white triangles on the top to kind of parody the white Zs that you used to see on the Russian invading forces. They've created their own insignia for the invasion. Is basically trolling the Russians. And you know what? Ukrainians needed that boost. So I think from a domestic point of view, that's very important. From an international point of view, signaling that Ukraine is still in the fight, that Ukraine is willing to take the fight to Russia, is equally important when we're at such a delicate time in the calendar, a couple of months out from a US presidential election.
I want to come on to the reaction in Moscow in a moment, but clearly this has taken Russia by surprise. But is it something that Zelensky, together with Budanov and Syrskyi and probably others besides, would have been planning for a while?
What you can see here is that this is a well-planned attack. And crucially, they retain the element of surprise, which they did not in 2023 when they were trying to break through. You know, everyone knew that they wanted to go south and push towards the Black Sea, you know, Melitopol and Tokmak, and that axis where they initially tried was well-trailed, and they lost the element of surprise. They kept it here, and that's been crucial for the breakthrough. And what you've seen is them execute the combined arms maneuver that those NATO Western countries were trying to teach them on, and were kind of ideally aiming for the 2023 counteroffensive that failed. But it has worked because it's in an area that's less well defended, and you know, it's been realistic about its aims as well. So yeah, this is a well-planned operation. Now we're coming to that fascinating point a week in, is, are they going to bed in? Are they going to dig in and try and keep hold of this ground? Or are they going to take the victory and move the fight on elsewhere?
I mean, that's a crucial question. What is your sense of things? Because, I mean, first of all, we don't definitively know how much territory they occupy. You hear conflicting reports, maybe 100 square kilometres of Russian territory, maybe 30 kilometres deep into Russia. What is the latest on that?
Syrskyi gave the figure of 1,000 square kilometres now, which is a significant parcel if you compare it, for example, to that Russian offensive towards Kharkiv about a month or two ago. It's much bigger than that already. What is the ambition of it is yet to be determined. I mean, I think if you look at where they have gone, they have not necessarily just, you know, barreled down those kind of main Russian roads towards big Russian cities and just gone kind of blitzkrieg. We're just going for it. We're as far as we can get. It's been more measured than that. So it's you know, it is very early to say what will happen next. But, of course, there are fears that if they become overconfident and you embed, and the Russians do successfully, redeploy troops, then they could be outflanked. And it appears that Ukraine has diverted some of its most well-equipped and well-trained brigades to this offensive. And so the nightmare scenario for them would be that those are wiped out.
So it could still very much go wrong from here. I mean, some would say, okay, it's only been a week, but already it's achieved its objective because it has made the world sit up and take notice. It's put Putin on the back foot. It's diverted troops from the front line in Ukraine. But if tomorrow Ukraine's troops were to be driven out of Kursk, would it be a failure?
Not necessarily, because it depends on what sort of, there can be that you can have retreats that are successful. I think what would be a failure if they're caught there, and if the Russians start sort of decimating them, pin them there, potentially outflank them or even surround them, and break their supply lines. That's a really bad scenario for them, because they have taken this gamble and moved these elite brigades from the fights where they have been kind of steadily accruing losses and put them instead in this offensive. So that's the nightmare. But no, I think if they were to execute a pretty, swift, successful withdrawal, even as Russia is still struggling to respond to this initial incursion, and then potentially take the fight elsewhere of their own choosing, then they are still taking the initiative. They're the ones who are asking the questions. They're the ones who are dictating where the war is being fought, which has not been the case, basically since the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Kherson, that kind of autumn of 2022. Since that point, this has been the kind of grinding trench warfare with limited maneuver that has favoured the larger army.
How long do you think it is realistic for Ukraine to hang on to the territory they've taken? I was speaking on yesterday's episode of Frontline to the military analyst Sean Bell. He said, look, this has clearly been a success so far for Ukraine, but he reckons within a month they will be driven out of Russia. What's your sense of things, George?
It depends how quickly the Russians mass their forces. So basically their response so far appears to have been pretty limited to Lancet loitering munitions, glide bombs dropped from the air. So it's principally been an aerial response. To what extent they get artillery, they get infantry, they get that kind of ground force there to kind of support that and push the Ukrainians back is still being established. It's the picture is moving pretty quickly. But if they are those, if the Ukrainians, by moving their own elite units from Chasiv Yar, from these battles in the Donbass and on the east, and they move them to this kind of incursion into Kursk from Sumy, and they force the Russians to respond by moving their own elite forces away from those battles, then that will count as a victory for Ukraine, because they're changing where the fighting is taking place. They're forcing those Russian elite units into fighting defensive battles rather than necessarily offensive ones.
And the transformative effect on Ukrainian morale, just how significant is that? I know you've been out to Ukraine in recent months, George. What was the mood then, and how much will this have changed things?
Yeah, what struck me particularly about the last time I was there, which was about a month ago, was, for example, the blackouts. This is not something that was a regular occurrence up until that point on previous visits I've been on. Now you have, in major cities across Ukraine, the kind of whir of the generator and the smell of diesel is a daily occurrence. That's part of life in Ukraine, because these energy attacks that the Russians really kind of stepped up in the, early spring really, were successful. They destroyed Kiev's largest energy power plant, and they have dramatically reduced their energy generating capacity. So that's coupled with the fact that obviously they were struggling to get that US aid for a long time. Still, the delivery of all that aid was coming through slowly. Towards the end of my time there, they were starting to be restocked, or it appeared to be restocked with Patriot and air defense missiles, and up until that point, their kind of hit rate of shooting down drones and ballistic missiles, cruise missiles from Russia had kind of fallen off since where it was maybe a year before or 6 months before. It seemed to be kind of gathering pace again. But, you know, the cumulative effect of the Ukrainians being on the defensive, Zelensky being forced to kind of order this new round of mobilization by changing the laws over when people were eligible for conscription. The whole narrative was very much of, you know, a beleaguered Ukraine fighting a rearguard action and losing the support of the world. Now, in a couple of weeks, F-16s have arrived and they've invaded Russia.
Let's come on to the reaction inside Russia. How humiliating a moment is this for Vladimir Putin?
I think we saw on his face, it was etched on his face, the disappointment, the anger about what had happened. You know, Russia has never lost territory to an external invader since the Second World War. This is something that is just totally runs against what Putin makes out that he is, that he's the defender of the fatherland. So it has been humiliating for him. There's no doubt about that. And the Russians are trying to play on his ego and play on that and his sense of history by taunting him into redeploying troops. And it was interesting that he was saying in his reaction, you know, where we're going to drive them out. He was like, and the Ukrainians are trying to get this for leverage for negotiations, and they're trying to get us to redeploy troops, but we will get them out. Well, he's going to have to redeploy troops to get them out, because what he currently has there, which was the FSB and the border guards, if they weren't, you know, slaughtered as the Ukrainians overran their checkpoints, they all downed tools and were taken as prisoners of war. So he even acknowledges that this might be a military trap that he's falling into, but he cannot allow himself, by how he presents himself and his image of himself as a strongman, to possibly concede this land.
How aware will ordinary Russians be of what's happening in the Kursk region? Clearly, if you live in Kursk Oblast, if you live in Belgorod, which has been evacuated, you will be conscious of it. But if you're an ordinary Russian in Moscow or St. Petersburg, is this on the news? Are they talking about this? Or is this so embarrassing they're trying to cover it up?
Well, Putin did, you know, effectively, I mean, it's not a press conference because no one gets to ask any questions, but he did that kind of classic staging of himself, giving orders and kind of telling off his officials for not foreseeing this, not preventing this well enough. He did all that, so they've certainly acknowledged it. But bear in mind, Russia is a big country, and you know, most events in Russia to most Russians feel distant because they are. So the degree to which we can expect some sort of political fallout to come from this, you know, let's no one should be getting over optimistic about this.
But clearly that is one of the potential objectives of the Ukrainians, to make ordinary Russians realise that this war, this special military operation that may have felt quite distant from them, suddenly feels much closer.
I think that's true, and I think that has been going on for a while as well. Bear in mind, they have been carrying out long-range drone strikes as well across Russia and hitting oil refineries and getting up to all sorts of skullduggery to try and, like you say, bring the war to Russia. That's definitely an aim. But also, I don't think we should lose fact of just the pure military fact that they have been on the back foot. They needed something to change the dynamic. You know, you know, I'll credit him for it, but John Foreman, who is the former British defence attaché in Moscow and you know, a very, very wise head on all these matters, he kind of gave me the analogy of a boxer. I don't know if you follow boxing at all, but if anyone who watched the Usyk-Tyson Fury fights, you will remember how Usyk, a Ukrainian, much smaller boxer, outthought and outmaneuvered a much larger, lumbering figure, you know, with deft footwork and, you know, keeping him moving, you know, and that you can start to see how that analogy applies to the situation where Ukraine, a much smaller army, needs to fight a war that is swifter, and they are dictating the terms, and it's done with a nimbleness and a speed that doesn't favor the Russian army, and in fact makes their size and the fact that they're trying to kind of have supply lines across, this huge army, make that into a weakness if they can. The danger with that, though, is that obviously creating a new section of front line means that arguably the Ukrainians with a smaller army have to patrol that and defend that, and that poses another significant problem for them, arguably.
Vladimir Putin also said in that televised statement you referenced a moment ago, George, that he thinks this is part of a negotiating strategy by Ukraine. What is your reading on that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have the US presidential elections coming up. Donald Trump has said within 24 hours of taking office, he plans to do a deal. Bear in mind, he was the one who met with Putin previously in Helsinki, famously at a summit. He thinks that he has some sort of relationship, and he thinks that by having talks with him and Zelensky, he can force a peace settlement. Now, as anyone will tell you, as any diplomat will tell you, or any businessman will tell you don't go into talks, or you don't initiate talks when you have a weaker hand. And up until this invasion, arguably Ukraine did have a weaker hand, and the Russians could dictate the terms of any talks. So having some sort of leverage is useful. I think that is predicated, though, on a tricky problem, though, for the Ukrainians, which is they would have to hold on to this land. And, even if by November, let's say Trump does win, and then by January he's inaugurated and he starts talks, that's a long period of time for them to hold this land. So I'm not as convinced by that argument. And then there are some more fanciful ideas that they're going to take the nuclear power plant outside Kursk and use that as a bargaining chip for the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. I think that's a little far-fetched.
What do you think the response has been privately in the capitals of Washington and London and Paris and Berlin and among Ukraine's Western allies? Will they be tacitly endorsing this? It was interesting, James Heappey, the former UK Armed Forces Minister, was on Times Radio Breakfast saying that he welcomes this, but he's a former politician now. If he was still the Armed Forces Minister, he would have to give a different line, and he wouldn't be able to publicly endorse this. How fine a line are Ukraine's Western allies having to tread on this?
Well, I think that's another point of the invasion. So the Germans and the Americans have stressed they didn't know anything about it. Now, the huge diplomatic own goal of that offensive on Kharkiv earlier this year was that it unlocked American approval for cross-border strikes into Russia. So by hiding behind that border, which was previously a red line, the Russians could drop glide bombs on Kharkiv and were doing so liberally. And it was threatening, Ukraine's ability to defend itself. That led to Biden saying, yes, you can use ATACMS to hit Russian sites across the border. They're now taking this further. They are using Marders, Strikers, German and American armored vehicles to invade Russia, further pushing the boat out on what they can do across the border, normalizing the idea of using Western weapons in Russia. And I think that, them setting the agenda for that is really interesting, particularly bearing in mind that they have just received their first F-16s, and F-16s, arguably their use is only going to become a real factor in the war if they are allowed to fire across the border and stop Russian jets from dropping glide bombs from the safety of Russian airspace.
And with the F-16s, I know a lot of analysts have said, look, with the numbers that Ukraine currently has and with the issues around training of the fighter pilots, we shouldn't overstate their likely impact. But do you think the fact that they have now arrived in Ukraine and they will start being deployed, coupled with this incursion into Kursk, means that the momentum is now decisively with Ukraine?
I wouldn't go as far as to say decisively. I think this incursion itself is in the balance at the moment. I think it's too early, genuinely, to say if it has been a success. But certainly they've stunned the Russians, put them on the back foot, and for the first time in several months, asking them questions. When it comes to F-16s, look, like you say, they're never going to have, a huge amount to compete with the Russian Air Force, but what they can act as is a sufficient deterrent for the cost of Russian fighter jets, operating just with inside Russia from being too high. That the cost benefit of being able to drop glide bombs from close to the border is not worth the risk and the cost of losing an aircraft potentially to an F-16 armed with an air-to-air missile.
I mentioned you've been in Ukraine recently. You've also been in Finland recently. Tell us about some of the conversations you had whilst you were there.
Yeah, I was in Finland last week, where Finland, obviously one of two countries that has joined NATO since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Up until that point, was a neutral country, or had tried to be. Obviously, has a history of fighting wars with Russia, the Winter War in 1939 to 1940. So they have always taken their defence very seriously. They have the largest army in Europe during wartime due to their high levels of conscription. But I was in a particularly interesting part of Finland, which is the Åland Islands. This is an archipelago between Finland and Sweden. It's actually Swedish speaking, but it belongs to Finland. And under the terms of a variety of treaties is a demilitarized zone, which is a kind of quirk within the Baltic Sea, which various people have decided to term the NATO lake ever since Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO, because apart from Russia, every other country is a member of NATO. And yet Åland is this demilitarized area within it. And some in Finland have argued a strategic vulnerability. So there is a question about whether or not it is they need to revisit that. The problem is Russia is a signatory to that treaty. By ripping up international law, arguably Russia no longer has a right to dictate the terms of what international treaties are. So, and it's also bearing in mind that the Swedes have a nearby island called Gotland, which is also very strategic. They remilitarized that after the Russian invasion of Crimea. So it's an ongoing question for the Finns. Obviously, it doesn't pose an imminent threat, and it's more hybrid warfare in the Baltic. So we've seen, the threat to submarine cables, the Russian shadow fleet of aging oil tankers shipping oil through there and potentially causing huge environmental damage should something go wrong. But, looking further ahead, the question of the Åland Islands demilitarized status is one thing to watch out for.
And what about this notion that Helsinki might be the venue for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, in Helsinki, we did an interview with the Finnish foreign minister, and she ruled out hosting peace talks there. Bear in mind, Finland did host those talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in 2018, I believe. It's really indicative of the path that Finland has taken and the own goal of the invasion, that Finland, a country that was declaredly neutral between Russia and the US, has now so decisively moved towards being pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia, pro-NATO, to the extent that even if America elected Donald Trump and he was kind of forcing peace terms on Ukraine, the Finns are saying, we want absolutely nothing to do with this.
George Grylls, defence correspondent for The Times, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks very much.